Hello, this is Mike Smith. Welcome back to another Maya tutorial. This time we're going to have a look at UV mapping. Now UV mapping is the process we use to unfold or unwrap a 3D object into its 2D form, and that's in preparation of texturing. And depending on the complexity of your object, it's probably the longest process of the whole texturing process. So first of all, make sure your project folder is set up and your scene is set to that project folder. Now I've got mine open on here. It's just called UV mapping and texturing for the tutorial, and you also need to make sure you have a source images subfolder in that main folder. You will get, if you haven't already done this you'll see, but you will get this workspace.mel file. Once your project folder is set up, just leave that one there. So we're going to have a look at unfolding and mapping some different objects. Now I've got lots of examples here. So we'll start with something really simple. We've got this cube here. Well, it's more of a wall shape, if you like. It's quite flat in one direction. So we're going to see how that looks when we actually unfold it. So make sure you're in your polygons menu set, and at the top of the screen go up to edit UVs and then UV texture editor. And when that opens up, you can zoom in and zoom out like we normally do. And if we have a look at this, you've actually got your grid in its 2D form, and you can see 0 in the middle, and we have our positive numbers going up and going right, and negative numbers going down and to the left. The important part of this grid is this grey area, and you can see that's all the positive numbers. So when we unwrap and actually unfold our object, we have to make sure it's in this grey area, otherwise it won't be available for us to actually apply texture. So looking at this, if you probably did in school, unwrap or make a three-dimensional cube or a box out of some card or paper, you can probably imagine the shape you're going to draw on that paper to actually fold this up. So what we get here is the representation of a 3D box. Now that's because it was the original poly primitive, it was an actual cube. And if I move this to one side, you'll see it doesn't really look like our shape on here. So what we need to do, first I'll just position this so we can see both things at the same time. Now you've got different options when it comes to UV mapping, depending on the shape. So if we go back up to create UVs, you can see there's different forms of mapping on here, and you really just have to experiment with those as a starting point. Now one that I like a lot is automatic mapping. If I go ahead and click on that, in our 3D view, our perspective view, you can see we've got these objects going around our main 3D object there. Maya basically takes a shot in every direction of our object, and it makes sure everything is the right proportion here over on our UV texture editor. So we can now see we've got these large squares that form the two sides of this shape. And if I go ahead and select the whole thing again, you have to be on object mode to view everything. You can then see we've got these different parts on here. So we know 2 of these will be the top and the bottom, the other 2 will be the sides. So we need to work out which one's which. And we can do that by going on to face mode. And if you select a face, it actually shows you which part that is in your UV texture editor. But we really want to see everything in one go, and we want to rearrange these and actually lay it out so we can really texture this. So if I go ahead and select everything again, go on object mode, and it depends what you want to apply as a texture. Now if I wanted to put, let's say, a brick wall texture around this, first of all, it doesn't matter what's on the bottom, and probably not the top, depending on if you're going to look at that. So you could, if you want to, actually delete the bottom if it makes it easier to map. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just go onto face mode, select that bottom face and actually delete it. Now as we progress onto other objects, I'll leave everything there so you can actually see what we can do, but for this, as it's the first one, I'll keep it as simple as possible. So once we've deleted that face, you'll notice it deletes out of our UV texture editor as well. And to show you what you can do up here, if we right click in our texture editor, we have the same modes that we normally have, but this important one here, UV, if I select that, what I can do is actually select a UV, and it's the same as a vertex, but it basically makes it editable in our UV texture editor. And you can see when I select that UV here, it also highlights in our 3D view, so we know exactly which part it is. And we could, if we wanted to, select several, and we could actually edit and move this object around. So just so you can see, if I select these UVs here, you might have to zoom in a bit more and manually go in and actually highlight on those. So I'm just holding shift and I'll select these individual UVs, and then we could just use our usual tools. You can use move, rotate and scale, and you can basically move these around anywhere you want. But what I really want is to actually have some of these different edges attached. So if I put a texture around this object, I can do that in one go on here. So what I'd like to do first is, in our 3D view, I'll go on to edge mode, and I'll select this first vertical edge because I want a brick texture going right the way around. I don't want to have a gap or anything there. And when I select that edge, you can see over in our texture editor, I'll zoom in a bit more just to make it clearer. We've got this edge here highlighted, and we also have this one up on this separate piece. Now rather than moving that manually down here, what we could do is in our UV texture editor window, go to polygons and then move and sew UV edges, and that actually moves this part up the top for us. And you do for a while get these overlapping faces, so just try to keep a mental note of where these different faces are. So we know we've got this smaller one here, and there was a separate larger one just in the middle here as well. So what I could do now is go back in my 3D view, and we could select another edge. So I'm just going to select this one, which was next to the right of the first one we selected, and we can see the two edges on here as well. So I go back to polygons, move and sew UV edges again, and it's just basically flipped this one around and it's actually snapped it on this edge. And now I'm going to select one more edge on the other side, and you can see now it's selected the left hand edge of this face and also this one that appeared to be hidden. So I'll go back to polygons, move and sew UV edges again, and now it's moved that hidden face over to one side here. And what I'll need to do now is manually move this other piece, which is our top face of this object. Remember, we deleted the bottom one, so it's just the top there. So in my UV texture editor window, I'll right click, go onto UV, and then I'll select or highlight over this object, and we could manually move that down. Then if we want to rotate it, you have actually got two options. You could go to your rotate tool in your usual tool palette, or if you look at the top of your texture editor window, we've got some different tools, and you've actually got a rotate tool here. The good thing with these is when you click on that, it snaps it to every 45 degrees. So if you click twice, it rotates at exactly 90 degrees, which is exactly what we want. So I can now just move this down and out of the way. then select all the UVs in our top object, and we need to move that to make sure it fits in this grey box. So let's just move it down a bit, and we'll need to scale it down too. You can see it's too wide. So I'll go to my scale tool, and I want to scale from the middle. I don't want to scale from just the side because it's going to actually distort the proportions. I'll scale just from the middle. And you want to make it as big as you can so it still fits inside this window. Okay, so that is actually ready to be textured, and I'll show you how to do that in a different tutorial. But for now, I'll just show you some different shapes so you can see exactly what they look like in their two-dimensional form. So I'll delete this object, and we want to have a look at some cylinders next. They're slightly different. They're pretty much the same in terms of how to unwrap them, but they just look different at first. So if I select this one, which is not mapped yet, now this is just the kind of representation you get, and if we first have a look at this part in the middle, we can see there's some different divisions on here, and there's these two close together in the middle, but if we look at our object, it doesn't have two close together in the middle. There are two, but they're much further apart. So straight away, that's not going to work. If you put a texture there, all that will happen is it will stretch this part of your texture. Anything you put on one of these faces will be stretched right over one of these, so it will distort. And it will actually compress the texture, so it will squash the texture on these parts. You can see in our texture editor window, these faces are quite long and thin, whereas in real life they're not. They almost look like just squares. So let's first of all have a look at some different types of mapping. Now, make sure you're on object mode. I'll go back to my select tool, and if we go to create UVs, let's try automatic mapping in. Let's see what happens there. Now, it's laid it out, they're in the right proportion, but before we do anything with that, I'll just show you some more options. Now you have cylindrical mapping. If I select that, it generally goes too big, but if I zoom out, we can see our different faces on here. Now I know I've got 10 different faces around this cylinder, and we can have a look. So we've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You've got all 10 there, all laid out. However, the top and the bottom have disappeared. We've just got these two thin lines here, so they're probably in there somewhere. So let's go back to create UVs. Spherical mapping isn't really going to work for this one, so I'm going to go back to automatic. And what we can do is the same process as before. We can select some edges and then move and sew those edges together. So first of all, I'm going to move the top and bottom parts here just out the way, so I've got more space. So right click, go to UV, and then I'll highlight that entire area, and make sure you just select the ones that you want. So I need to zoom in a bit more and just select these two, holding shift to make sure you keep the other ones selected as well. And I'll just go back to my move tool, and I'm going to move those just up and out the way. I'll put them right in the corner of this. We might need to move them a bit further later on if we need to, but at least they're just up out the way for a while. So let's have a look at what we have here. I could go on to edge mode, and we can have a look at selecting some of these edges. Now, as I select one, so if I select this one, you can see it selecting another one up here as well. So at least we know roughly where it's going to go. If I select this one, so that's going to go over this side, so I could select that. Now what I need to do here, because there's all these divisions, I'm going to zoom in a bit closer, and I'm going to select that entire row, all of those vertical edges, just because I don't want the shape to actually distort. So hold shift and select all of these edges. And once you've got those selected, you can see it matches the other part here as well. We've got all these edges selected too. And I can now just go back to polygons, move and sew UV edges again. So that's moved this part over. It has squashed this face, but we can correct that later on. If you look at the width of that compared to the others, it's slightly squashed, but we can correct that easily. Now, if I select one of the others, let's have a look. So go back to edge mode, and let's see which one that is. Okay, I can't see anything on here selected, so it's probably, oh there it is, this one down the bottom. So I'm going to do the same as before. I'll select that entire vertical row. Zoom in nice and close if you need to. Okay, we've got the entire row there selected. Polygons, move and sew UV edges again. And let's snap those, so we can do the last part now. Let's have a look to see which bits line up. Okay, so this part here, we can see it just highlighted at the top. So we'll do the same process again. Hold shift and select the other edges. Once they're selected, polygons, move and sew UV edges, and we should now have a row of all 10 faces there. And if you look at these divisions now, we can see that they match the proportion of this quite well. So for example, this face I'm highlighting on now is square, and all these ones are quite square as well. You can see that some are slightly narrower, so we can manually adjust that. So right click and go to UV, and I'm going to highlight that entire part, and I'll use the move tool just to stretch that out a bit to match the other ones. And the same with this one. You can adjust these after you've applied a texture, but it's best to get it set up first of all. So if you do see people adjusting the UVs after they've put a texture on, it does work, but it's not the best way to go about it. Try and get your UVs set up perfectly first. And we'll just do this end one as well. We can always scale it in if we need to. Okay, so if you look at this edge on the right, it's gone slightly outside of this grey box, so we need to select the entire object, and I'm just going to move that across a tiny bit to make sure everything fits inside that box. I'll move it up just a bit as well to give myself more space at the bottom. Okay, and the last thing I'll do is just move these two parts further apart, so I've got more space when I work in Photoshop later on to actually apply that texture. Okay, so that's all ready. Now if you have lots of the same object in your scene, once you've mapped one of them, if you duplicate that object, it will also duplicate the UV map that you've set up. So if for example you had 20 cylinders that are all the same object, even if they're going to be different textures, you've only got to map one of them. Okay, so let's look at one more object. And we'll have a look at this one that looks like the roof of a house. Now in this one I just want to give you a couple of tips. For example, you can see the objects look exactly the same, but in this one on the left we've got these different divisions. You need to really make sure your model is carefully planned and really as simple as possible to keep your UV mapping process as efficient as possible. So these edges I have on this side, I've put them on there on purpose, just so I can show you what we can do. Now we don't need them. If you look at the object on the right, it's exactly the same minus the divisions. So to make life easier, delete these edges off. If you go into edge mode, double click on one of those edges to select around the entire object. I'll hold shift and double click on the others as well, and I'm going to delete those. So if you have divisions in your object you don't need, unless you're going to smooth it, but if you don't need them, just delete them. And rather than pressing backspace, because that will just delete the edge, not the vertices, we need to go up to edit mesh and then delete edge and vertex. And straight away that makes our UV map a lot easier to understand. So this will just be a quick example. This particular object, I've not gone through any kind of mapping on this one yet, and it actually looks like it's quite well laid out. I just need to make sure which face is which. Now when you're applying a texture on a roof, obviously the top of the roof has the priority over the bottom. You're not really going to see the inside very much. So what I'm going to do is go to face mode, and I'm going to select some faces. If I just go back to my object and center that in my scene, I'm going to select the very bottom of both sides, and I'll also select the main sides to the roof, just on the top though. And then the top. So if we look at our UV texture map now, you can see these are separate objects. So we really want all of these to go together. So what I can do is actually split some of these up and then move them to the other side. So I'll go back to object mode to bring up my entire one. So from that we know that these two large faces here and this thin one are actually the inside of my house. You could leave it as it is if you want to, but I'll just show you how to move these around. So if you wanted a texture to go over the top of this and underneath each part on the side, you need to make sure these two thin boxes here are actually connected to this part of our UV map. So what I could do is right click and go to edge mode in my 3D view, and I'll select this part here, and you can see if we look in, we can see which edges they are. Now these ones are already detached. You can see it's the left hand edge of this part and the right hand bit here as well. They're already detached, so I need to select a different one. So I'm going to rotate underneath my object, and I'm going to select this one on here. Now you can see that's this part here. It's already connected on there, but I want to detach that, and I'll also hold shift and select this other edge, and that brings up two edges on here that are connected. But what I could do now is in my texture editor window, go onto polygons and split UVs, and that will actually detach these. So when I use my move and sew UV edges tool, I can actually move these separately without upsetting what's already here. So I'll quickly show you that. If I go onto edge mode, and I'll select this very end edge, and we really want this to be brought over to this side. If I now go to polygons, move and sew UV edges, it moves it over there separately from this because we actually split that edge. And we'll do this end one here as well. We can see it's these two. You can see it's connected here, and because we actually split that UV, it should move over like the last one without upsetting this. So polygons, move and sew UV edges, and it's moved it across. So now we know this, what we actually call a shell, if it's one particular part in the UV map, it's called a shell. This shell is the whole top of the roof and also these parts underneath. It's just now the inside of the roof that is separate, because you won't really see that in your model. So now what we could do, like we did with the previous ones, is just rotate parts of this around. So I'm going to right click and go to UV, and I'll select part of this, which is actually the side. Unfortunately, it already had this split up for us. I'll hold Control and deselect these. I don't want these parts on here. And we can go ahead and use the rotate tool that's already in our UV texture editor. So I'll click twice on that to rotate 90 degrees. And I'll just move that over to one side and do the same for this piece. So I've had to select too much, and I'm just going to hold Control, deselect these, and again click on my rotate tool twice for 90 degrees, and then just move that over. Okay, so that's mapped and ready to be textured. If you want, we could move this part over as well, just to give you some more space, but it's up to you. I'll just move it over a little bit there so we've got a bit of a gap. Okay, so I'm going to have to do this tutorial in two parts. In the next part, I'll show you how to actually split a more complicated shape. If we have a look on here, I've got some pillars, and there's different options for this. So have a look at my part 2 of this tutorial, and we'll go through how to map these.